Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. Today we are continuing with episode 2 of our 3-part series on the Classic Greek Temperaments. So last week we went through exactly more of like what temperament is, talked a little bit about just a general overview of the 4 temperaments, what they are, kind of their origin. Today what we're going to do is look at each of these 4 temperaments more so in detail and look at like characteristics of each one. And so hopefully in today's episode, if you haven't found a temperament test yet or something like that, you can kind of get an idea of what your temperament might be. And so just kind of sit back and see exactly which of these characteristics kind of rings true for you and see if you can get an idea of what your temperament might be. So if you remember last time we talked about these temperaments, we talked about it kind of like in a circle, the top left quadrant being the choleric, the top right being the sanguine, the bottom right being the phlegmatic, and the melancholic being the bottom left of that circle. And so we're going to kind of go in that particular order. We're going to start with the choleric and we're going to move clockwise in that order there. So with that, starting with the choleric, if you remember last week, we talked about the fact that the choleric is an extrovert, but also a thinker, very much driven on principles as opposed to people. And so characteristics of the choleric, they tend to take charge rather easily. This is something that in the book that we're getting a lot of this material from, The Temperament God Gave You. It says that, unsurprisingly, most of the worst dictators in the history of the world have been cholerics. And for me as a choleric, that's almost insulting, but at the same time, to realize that that's part of the nature of a choleric is to take charge. There's this sense of wanting to be in control. And so it's not surprising that some of the worst dictators in the history of the world have been cholerics because they take charge. Cholerics tend to react very quickly and intensely. And this is another axis we can kind of look at here. If you look at the sanguine and the choleric, your 2 extroverts, they both tend to react quickly to anything, whereas the phlegmatic and the melancholic will be slow to react to things. Now, what the melancholic and the choleric share is that they both react intensely to things. And then on the flip side, you have the sanguine and the phlegmatic who will tend to not react intensely to almost anything. And so with that, you'll see how each of these 4 temperaments have a combination of those 2 axes. So the choleric will react quickly and intensely. They tend to be very over the top. And they will react immediately to something, and that reaction is very exaggerated. Cholerics also tend to be very decisive. They don't like sitting around and waiting for things. They like to take action. They like to operate, and they don't like to sit and think things out too much. They want to be action-oriented. As we mentioned before, they're extroverted, and they tend to be very self-confident. Cholerics tend to, just because of the sense of like pride, maybe in a way, that's the dominant defect of the choleric. The choleric tends to be very self-confident. They tend to be very direct as well. Cholerics will shoot from the hip. When I think of cholerics, I think of somebody like General George Patton. If you ever get to watch the 1970 movie Patton, you'll see exactly what I mean by that. Patton is somebody I would certainly consider to be a historical choleric. where he's very direct. He shoots from the hip, and he doesn't sugarcoat anything. And that's what cholerics tend to be. They tend to think very independently as well. They're not the kind to go with the flow. They will hold to their own principles and swim upstream if necessary. Cholerics tend to be very enthusiastic and energetic as well, usually very charismatic. Again, they thrive on activity, and they usually find work to be invigorating. In scripture, I think of Saint Martha, someone who's constantly doing something, constantly working. And for the choleric, and I can definitely attest to this, there's a high value on success and achievement. This is very much built into the choleric. The fact that they're constantly working towards something, there's something to be achieved in everything. And what we'll do is we'll talk about, either in this episode or the next one, we'll talk about like motivation with each of these temperaments and what motivates them particularly. For the choleric, that's one of them, is finding something to base achievement with, and as a motivating factor for the choleric. I want to talk about some strengths and weaknesses for each of these temperaments as well. So for the choleric, let's talk about some strengths. Cholerics tend to be extremely rational. Because I said so is not a good answer or a good explanation for them. You know, when you're talking to a choleric child, in the next episode, we're going to talk more about like family life. When you're talking to a choleric child and they ask why, when you tell them to do something, don't just say because I said so. And they're not asking this question, why? This goes for any choleric, not just a child. They're not asking this question to be rebellious. They legitimately want to know why. Because the reality is cholerics are principle based. So if you can convince them of the principle behind something, if you convince them, you win them over. And so they are very much rational in that aspect. Cholerics tend to focus on the big picture, and they tend to want to see things from the top down. They like seeing the direction of things, not so much the intricacies. They want to know exactly where you're going, what's to be achieved, what's the big picture, what's the goal. They're usually pretty darn organized and gravitate towards positions of authority. They're usually not inclined to delegate tasks. And I can speak to this as well. Many times a choleric will say, if I can do something better and faster, more efficiently and more effectively than somebody else, they tend to not care about the person's feelings. And they will take charge and tend to do that. They don't like delegating because if they can do it better and faster, then they will do it that way. And so besides that, they thrive on productivity. Now, some weaknesses of the choleric. Cholerics tend to be quick to judge and form opinions. Again, they react quickly. And so they'll charge full speed ahead without any kind of reflection or compassion. Again, they're more so on the principle side of things. So they tend to operate on that regard. They don't like to read directions. And I remember putting together a bookshelf one time, and I put the wrong screws in the wrong place. And I had to almost completely redo a shelf because I put the wrong screws in the wrong place because I didn't read the directions quite thoroughly. All right. So yes, we tend to not read directions on things. We're pretty darn impatient. Again, we like to move forward with things. We like to achieve things. And so we tend to operate at a pretty high pace. So we're not very patient. We tend to be dictatorial. Again, mentioning those dictators. We're usually ambitious, rigid, hard-hearted. I think the choleric would probably be considered very pharisaical in biblical terms. They default to sins of pride and anger. So with that, let's move on to, actually, we're going to go to the melancholic next. We're going to go in a little bit different order than I previously mentioned. The melancholic we're going to go with because it's a little more similar to the choleric. We're going to go kind of in this thought of we're going to stick with our principled people, and then we're going to go to more of our feelers afterwards. So the melancholic, when I think of like a good example of a melancholic, perhaps an exaggerated example would be Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Eeyore tends to be very down on himself, but tends to have a lot of these following characteristics. Reacts slowly but intensely. So the melancholic, sometimes it takes a while because they're deep thinkers and they have a very deep capacity for reflection. It takes them a while to kind of think about how they feel about something. But then once they get that thought, once they kind of settle on a reaction, they can be very intense with that reaction. It just takes a while to get to that intensity. Melancholics tend to be sensitive, again, because they're very deeply reflective, very deeply in touch with themselves. Idealistic and principled. Saint Teresa of Avila used to say that for the melancholic, that people have a hard time living on earth because of the imperfections that everything on earth falls so short of the perfection of heaven. So again, they tend to be very idealistic in principle. Melancholics are deeply concerned about injustice and vice, again, because of principles. But they, excuse me, at the same time, they do have a compassion for humanity. Melancholics tend to be persevering, and especially when it regards teamwork. While the choleric tends to start off with the vision, the melancholic will often help to carry out that vision to its fruition. And with that, the melancholic, because they're more of the introvert side, they tend to be more attentive to details. And so with that, they're a great part of the team to look at things, to find problems, to analyze parts of whatever project you're working on. That's general characteristics of the melancholic. Let's talk about some strengths here. Again, they have an eye for perfection. They're great at fine-tuning details of simple and complex things. They tend to see things more from the bottom up. Once they understand what the goal, the direction is, perhaps set by the choleric, they will tend to make sure that all the gears line up towards that goal. They tend to be very faithful with forming a relationship. And I would say you definitely do not want to break the trust of a melancholic. They will take that very, very much to heart and feel that deeply. Melancholics actually tend to handle major crises gracefully. Again, I think of Eeyore, that anytime something happened, he didn't exactly freak out. Eeyore is normally very kind of, not to say easygoing, but more even keeled, where he would just kind of see things and still have that kind of slow reaction to things. But at the same time, he's aware of what's going on. Again, they have a very deep capacity for spiritual life because of this kind of natural ability to introspect. When it comes to times of trial, they tend to be someone who's good to fall back on. And then also very calm under pressure. They work great with precision to detail, consistency, organization, in-depth analysis, whenever all these things are needed. So now some weaknesses of the melancholic. Again, all these temperaments have strengths and weaknesses. So for the melancholic, their idealism can easily cause them to be critical of others who, quote unquote, don't measure up. They tend to be very judgmental, like the choleric as well. So while being very faithful themselves, if their trust is violated, they can be very unforgiving. So again, it's so important for melancholics not to disobey that trust. And failing to achieve perfection can result in a lack of self-confidence. Again, because they have this idea that perfection is something to be achieved. And if they don't measure up to that, there is this kind of personal sense that they take to it. They need a strong spiritual life. Otherwise, they can become kind of like Eeyore, become depressed. I think of a particular video where Eeyore is given a new tail by Kanga, who sewed him a new one because he lost his previous tail. And he says, "It's an awful nice tail, Kanga, much nicer than the rest of me." So that kind of sense of like depression or maybe lacking in self-confidence, lacking in self-image. They tend to lack exterior enthusiasm. Even if they really are enthusiastic about something, it's hard to get them to smile sometimes. I think of a particular friend of mine who doesn't smile too much. When she does smile, it's awesome. But for them, even when they're excited about something, they don't tend to convey that emotion quite as easily as, per se, a sanguine or a choleric, your extroverted guys. So with that, we just mentioned the sanguine. Let's turn to these sanguines. All right. Again, these are our extroverts, really on steroids. They're extroverted people persons, very bubbly, very easy to get along with. Everybody just loves sanguines for some reason because they tend to be very energetic. They're the life of the party. We tend to like sanguines, and I find a lot of people, and I personally struggled with this as well when I first started this temperament work. I wanted to be a sanguine, because they seem like the cool people. They seem like the people everyone wants to be. But just like everybody else, they have strengths and weaknesses. So characteristics of the sanguine. They're very, 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 did I say very optimistic? Again, tend to be very much glass half full kind of people. They react quickly, but this reaction does not last very long. They're kind of the people who will they'll react to something, but they'll forget about it very quickly. I think about a friend of mine who's also a priest. We call him the squirrel. And he is certainly a sanguine, very extroverted, loves to be around people, constantly flitting from one thing to another. And he'll react immediately to something and then forget about it 2 seconds later. So again, this kind of sense that they react quickly, but not intensely. They're very outgoing because of this as well. Sanguines are also very attuned to their senses. They like bright, shiny, colorful things. They're the kind of people that will gift wrap things or love receiving presents that are wrapped simply because they love like the color of the paper and things like that. They're also energized by large groups. Sanguines like to be the life of the party. So for them, being in large groups, that's their jam. They love being in that environment. And also because they want to please others. That's one reason why they like being around big groups. They want to be people pleasers. They love to be the center of attention, life of the party. And for them, they almost tend to prefer having a large quantity of friends, simply because, again, there's the sense of wanting to please so many people there. So let's look at some specific strengths and weaknesses. The sanguines have a great gift, and this is in strengths here, have a great gift of being able to live in the present. Again, they're not so much dwelling in the past. They don't brood over past faults. At the same time, they're not so much concerned about what they're going to do tomorrow or the day after or even a month from now. They tend to live very much in the moment. And so I like to call this a bit of like a Hakuna Matata mentality, almost like this no worries. I think of Timon and Pumbaa because of this kind of like just live in the moment kind of thing. They're usually very inspiring people as well. Some of my best friends who are sanguines, I know them to be very inspiring people and people that I tend to fall back on whenever I'm just kind of just feeling this kind of drudgery or just in a rut. You know, I have some good friends who are sanguines that I'll call and talk to, and they're really, really good at inspiring people and picking people up again. They're good at being relational because of this. And then also their combination of kind of fleeting reactions in this worry-free mentality makes them very easy to forgive and forget. Again, they'll react quickly, but not intensely. They're more likely to let things go in that regard. They work well in service or in like public relations. If you want somebody to be a good hostess or somebody to work with customer service, or even just like to work in like customer sales representatives, something like that, you know, they're great in those capacities because, again, they're people pleasers. They're very enthusiastic. They can help with managing people's feelings and things of that nature, help people to be brought up. So they're great in those particular kind of roles. All right, now the weaknesses of the sanguine. They tend to wear their heart on their sleeve, which really tends to be a double-edged sword. They have a great capacity for empathy. Again, they're people pleasers. They're in tune with others' feelings, but they themselves are also easily hurt. They're very vulnerable with people. And so because of that, again, it acts as a two-edged sword. They can experience difficulty in fostering depth. And that can be anything in terms of prayer, in terms of relationship, in terms of studies. Things tend to stay more at a surface level with the sanguine, simply because they're fleeting. They tend to jump from one thing to another. So they don't give so much time to cultivating depth in some things. They can come off as being somewhat superficial. You know, people think they're putting on an act, or they're just so nice that it's unbelievably nice how nice they are. And so for them, they can seem superficial. The shortness and duration of their reactions can sometimes make them inconstant. They tend to be, again, flitting from one thing to another in a constant state of flux. When I think of a good classical Greek philosopher that could describe them, I think of Heraclitus, who said that everything is flux. Everything is changing for the sanguine. They tend to speak before they think, oftentimes like the choleric. And this sometimes results in exaggerations. This is something big in South Louisiana where people tend to exaggerate the size of the fish that they catch. And so sanguines will more than likely be ones to exaggerate how big the fish was that they caught. They'll probably hold it up to the camera real close to make it look bigger than it actually is. And then often sanguines will end up apologizing for hurting someone's feelings as well, especially if they realize that they rushed into some kind of harmful action. They will apologize for that. And finally, our phlegmatics. Again, these are our introverted people persons. And so some general characteristics of the phlegmatic. They react slowly and with very little intensity. So they're on the lower spectrum for both of these things. So they're very, very easygoing, very even-keeled. They tend to be reserved, prudent, sensible, and reflective. They're not easily insulted or provoked. I like to say for the phlegmatic, a good motto for them is semper gumbi, meaning always flexible. They are the kind of people who will bend incredibly and not break. They tend to be loyal and committed, very much a go with the flow attitude, non-confrontational. They hate conflict. Some of my best friends I know to be phlegmatics. They're just very peace-loving people. Not that they're hippies or anything, but they just hate conflict. They're very thoughtful listeners. These are people you can talk to all day. If you're having a problem, they will sit there and listen, and they just like to listen. They tend to be very calm and collected as well. So like the room could be on fire and they will actually walk and not run to the nearest exit, if you can imagine that. That's how these phlegmatics are. When I think of maybe a good example, like in movies, I like using movie characters for examples. I think of Master Oogway from the Kung Fu Panda movies. And Master Oogway, when he receives the news that Tai Lon has escaped from prison, you know, he kind of has a bit of a wide-eyed reaction of shock, but it's not over the top. Master Shifu is going off in this kind of sense of shock and really just hysteria. But Master Oogway is just very graceful in this, receiving the news. And so I think of Master Oogway when it comes to phlegmatics. Let's talk about some phlegmatic strengths. They tend to be very easygoing, and so they're easy to get along with. I know in the seminary, I think some of my best friends were phlegmatics. They tend to, because they were opposite of me, they tend to help balance me out. And there were people I knew I could talk to, who I knew I wouldn't find judgment in, so they're great to get along with usually. They tend to be very clear and thoughtful in writing or speaking. Again, thoughtfulness, because they're people persons. Usually very empathetic listeners as well. They tend to prefer, again, being non-confrontational. So they're great peacekeepers, they're great mediators, they're great diplomats for that reason. Very dependable, punctual, orderly in the workspace. They excel in detachment from material things. And so perhaps as we're recording this right now, it's actually Ash Wednesday, as we enter the season of Lent. Phlegmatics tend to do a really good job in like detachment, perhaps detaching them things from something you would fast from during the season of Lent. So now we have our phlegmatic weaknesses. The phlegmatics, because of their preference to avoid conflict, may lead to indifference when action needs to be taken. You can't just sit around and do nothing, as much as they prefer to not have conflict. Sometimes you do have to have compromise, and sometimes conflict has to be had for the sake of resolving things. Otherwise, you just ignore a problem that will continue to persist. Unlike the choleric, who often needs to learn control of their passions and enthusiasm, the phlegmatic usually needs help in being aroused towards action. And so it might take them too long to come to a decision to act. They may try to avoid anything that causes friction or difficulty, including physical labor. So with that, I'd like to kind of shift into motivation, because now that we kind of have these characteristics, maybe you're starting to see more of which one you are. How do you motivate someone of each of these temperaments? How do you get them going? How do you get them not to be manipulative, but how do you get them to strive towards something that's higher, maybe in the sense of holiness or virtue, if anything, to motivate them in that regard? And so for the choleric, one of the greatest challenges is setting the right goals. And so cholerics, they tend to move between goals very quickly. So for them, it's important to set the right goals from the start. And making sure that you don't just have a goal for the sake of having a goal, that it's actually a good goal, it's a correct goal. Also need to be challenged by reason. Again, we talked about the compliance with usually like a choleric child. So a good example is to challenge them to do something that you want them to do. And so like in the book, for example, they use this to say that if you have a child, you want them to clean their room, challenge them, say, I bet you can't clean your room in just 15 minutes. So things like that, getting them to see things as a challenge, as something to be achieved, will help to motivate them. A few other things, just maybe some general comments you could say, complimenting on their ideas, to say that your idea is really, really awesome. Looking at making sure that you check things, to say like, I think you're moving in the right direction, but let's check this goal to make sure it's good before we start on something. Asking them, what does the rest of the group think about this? And not just because they came up with the idea, just moving forward with it, making sure they do actually have some awareness as to what the rest of the group thinks. And then brainstorming ideas so that they don't fall into pitfalls. For the melancholic, the challenge for them tends to be getting started on things. Once things are started, they tend to pick things apart very, very easily. A lot of the time for them, it's getting motivated to actually start and initiate something. They tend to be indecisive. And so for them, they need to set priorities. Sometimes maybe there's so many tasks to be accomplished with an overall project that they just kind of get swamped in their thoughts as to where do I even begin? And so for a melancholic, a good way to motivate them is simply to help them prioritize. They rely heavily on momentum. If something stops, it's very much a buzzkill for them. And so they need to be able to build confidence. Also in doing things and actually being able to work on things in a timely manner, being able to take their time, not taking work away from them as well. And telling them that they're not just the right person for the job, they're the perfect person for the job. So again, like, how do you motivate them? Maybe some good compliments. Complimenting them on their analysis, perhaps, like the way that they're picking things apart, to say thank you for calling out this mistake, or helping them, asking them, like, how can I help you start? How can I help you move forward? Again, sometimes helping to initiate a project is very, very good for them. Our sanguines. The challenge for the sanguine is persevering until the end. They'll more than likely have more than enough enthusiasm to begin a project. What often happens, because the sanguine tends to flit from thing to thing, is they tend to not commit to something. They tend to, when something else or something more interesting comes around, to just drop what they're doing right then and there and then chase after the next acorn, if we're using the squirrel analogy again. They like to take on many projects, but sometimes they fail to see them through. They're big picture like the choleric is, and they definitely need help with finer details. They're usually pretty darn creative, but we have to help them with scheduling things, making sure they stay committed to a schedule, finding some kind of structure and routine, and just maintaining the direction of projects. They need to be taught that hard work and patience yield the best reward. Again, because they flip from thing to thing, patience is a really important virtue for the sanguine. And being able to really see things through to the end, and just helping with, like, helping to have them enjoy what they're working on. For them, they're people persons, so for them, if things are strictly business, a sanguine's probably just going to check out. So maybe if you're working on something with a sanguine, say, hey, can we meet over coffee to work on this or to plan this? Make it somehow relational. If you make things relational for the sanguine, that normally helps them to get motivated to do what you want them to do. Again, because they revolve around people skills, thinking or feeling rather. So for them, how do we maybe motivate the sanguines? To praise their ideas, to say, let's work on this together. Again, make it relational, or say, hey, let's go to the coffee shop and work on these things. Trying to make things as relational as possible is really, really good for the sanguine to help them stay motivated and committed to something. Moving on to the motivating phlegmatic. The challenge for the phlegmatic is overcoming obstacles. So for them, they need to learn how to set goals, because they oftentimes will just get swamped by direction as well, kind of like the melancholic. And then from there, to continue to initiate things, to continue to see things through. They tend to conform for the sake of preserving harmony. There's a particular concept, especially in psychology, known as groupthink. And what groupthink is a group coming together and trying to get a consensus on something simply for the sake of consensus. Now, that could mean they're in the consensus in the right, but that also means they're in the consensus in the wrong as well. And so for that, the sense of groupthink is something the phlegmatic might tend to fall into. Why? Because they tend to be negotiators. They tend to be peaceful. They do not like conflict whatsoever. And so they will tend to just fall into and follow the crowd, if just for the sake of preserving peace. But again, that doesn't save them in the long run. And so what's really important for the phlegmatic is not to take work away from them either. Again, they might not work at the same pace as the choleric. Cholerics and sanguines tend to work fast. The melancholic and the phlegmatic do not, again, because they're trying to pick apart the details of things. So the last thing you should do for a phlegmatic is take their work away, because this really just diminishes their sense of confidence. They're at their best when their confidence is built up. If you help to build up their confidence, you help them see value in themselves, phlegmatic will be a wonderful contributor to any group that you're doing. And make sure they feel that they are a key player, that they're important. If you make sure that they feel that they are, in fact, a valued part of a group, that will help to motivate them. Be impressed about their ideas, help them also with seeing into the future. The phlegmatic tends to be so much go with the flow that there's maybe this lack of sense of initiating planning for something. So help them with that. Help them to be able to see their progress. Measuring their progress is very, very good for helping to motivate them as well. And so we're going to move into the one last little section for this particular episode. We're going to go into the spiritual life for each one. Again, the whole reason why we're doing this whole temperament study is to realize how this helps us with who we are as we were created by God, each as individuals. And so there's a goal in the spiritual life. There's a goal in the virtuous life with all these things with the temperaments. And so I do want to talk specifically about these things. So moving in that same order, the choleric. What does a choleric spiritual life look like? For them, it has a lot to do with moving prayer, moving the relationship with God from the head to the heart. I think in the last episode, we talked about that Albert Einstein quote to ask, before you decide, before you start acting with your head or your heart, you have to figure out which one you trust more. Do you have a better head or a better heart? So with this, for the choleric, because they tend to be thinkers, they will tend to keep prayer in the mind. They'll do a lot of meditation, a lot of kind of reading with things, maybe tend to junk up prayer with things that just kind of engage the mind, but they really have to work on engaging the heart. Because again, this is the Lord says, I desire a clean heart for you. I desire to give you a new heart and a new spirit, right? It doesn't say I desire to give you a new mind so much. We hear a lot about the desire for God to have our hearts. And so for the choleric, that is super important. They do need a very well-developed prayer life, though. Otherwise, they will tend to live on a very natural level. Without the prayer life, again, they fall into their dominant tendencies of sin, which is to be prideful, cruel, as we've seen with dictators, violent. They're not natural followers, so they must learn to follow Christ. There has to be the sense where they learn to be a follower in that regard. Oftentimes, they'll need good spiritual direction, so that they don't follow their own will exclusively or just always assume that they're right. And so it's helpful for them, perhaps in the Our Father, a key petition there is thy will be done, focusing again on what God desires and not so much on their own will. Very much important for them to receive the sacrament of confession, this admission of guilt, this admission of the fact that I've messed up, to counteract that sense of pride. And so perhaps a good spiritual friend for them would be St. Paul, someone who I think really, really goes from head to heart. And you see that conversion in his life. So now the melancholic, what does a spiritual life look for them? And so for them, I mentioned St. Teresa of Avila a while ago. She is certainly a melancholic saint with the sense of, again, longing for heaven and longing for the perfection of heaven that we can't quite find here on earth. And so with that, the desire for perfection can lead to a great deal of scrupulosity. These are people who in confession might come up and say, Father, I had a piece of chicken stuck in my teeth and I kind of swallowed it, within an hour before mass. Is that a mortal sin? And I'm sitting there thinking, no, that's not a mortal sin. Like, come on, man. And so they'll tend to struggle with that because again, they desire perfection so much that they really, really stress some of the imperfections that they encounter in their lives. So finding God's mercy in confession is very, very helpful with the scrupulosity. For them, I think it's really important for the melancholic to see God as merciful. We say God is both just and merciful. I think for the melancholic really needs to focus on God's mercy and to be able to receive that mercy. They tend to focus so much on justice and injustice that for them, it really is important to I would say maybe have even a devotion to divine mercy, where they're reflecting on the fact that God is merciful with us, especially if we are contrite. Because in my experience, some of the most contrite people I've ever met are melancholics. And so again, that emphasis on God's mercy. The sanguine, I think of some of the Psalms, especially like Psalm 100, cry out with joy to the Lord, all the earth, serve the Lord with gladness, the sense of joy. I think maybe of like King David dancing in the streets, dancing in front of the Lord. That's what usually I summarize a sanguine spiritual life with. They first and foremost have to place their trust in God before people. We hear in the scriptures as well, put no trust in princes in whom there is no help. Take away their breath and they return to clay, and their plans that day come to nothing. So for the sanguine, again, trusting, they can't trust people, but to put their trust more in God than in human beings. They really need to develop control over their emotions. This is someone who maybe keeps prayer only at the level of the heart and not so much in the mind, and contemplating like the truths of God, his truth, goodness, beauty, all these transcendentals of being that we attribute to God. actually being able to think about these things and not so much just living so much in relation and being so attuned to people's feelings that they think that, they're just always right with God and have no need of contrition for that regard. And so it's important for them also to not be led astray by unscrupulous people, again, because they tend to be so forgiving of people. If there's no scrupulosity whatsoever, there might be the sense of like, bless me, Father, but I have not sinned, is maybe the attitude and confession you might hear from them. They have to listen to me. They have to pray in places that engage senses. Again, because they're so in tune to external things, they need that engagement. So having nice sacred art, sacred architecture, sacred music, incense, all the smells and bells, like for them, they should be very much at home in a very well celebrated mass, especially on a feast day or solemnity when you have all these things normally in place. For them, they really like having that engagement. And even those things, these externals do lead us to God. It can't be the end of itself. Like there has to be this actual appreciation for receiving the sacraments, for the truths that are there, and not just the externals. But that is very important for the sanguine. So having a good prayer space for them is really important. And then also a good daily examination of conscience helps to nurture discipline. Again, because they tend to flip from thing to thing. They need that sense of discipline, and a good daily examine would be great for them. When I think of sanguines who were saints, I think of St. Peter, someone who always tended to really just act first and ask questions later, someone who really just jumped into things, always said what was on the top of his mind, seems to be going from thing to thing. St. Peter is definitely probably a good sanguine saint to reflect on. And now our phlegmatic. The phlegmatic spiritual life, I think of really with the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, and also to say that meekness is not weakness. The phlegmatics typically have a very deep prayer life, but they can be sometimes lazy. They can very much fall into the sin of sloth, or we could call them maybe spiritual couch potatoes. And so for them, maybe the season of Lent's frightening, the sense of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, all these things that seem to be very arduous, things that are very hard to do, might make them scared. Maybe praying for a whole hour, making a full holy hour, might seem like a lot to kind of take on at one time. So helping them to build up to these things is important. Structure helps them stay committed. Again, almost like the sanguine, because they share in that kind of sense of lacking structure. So for them, they have to build confidence in Christ. Again, we talk about the phlegmatics need to build confidence. They need to be confident in Jesus, to be confident in God and what he's able to do for us. And so for them, because they tend to engage a lot in the sense of feelings and things as well, imaginative prayer, I think, is great for them. And not to bury their talents like we hear in the Gospels either. For phlegmatic saints, St. Thomas Aquinas is usually a really, really good one for them. So that's a lot of material right there, simply just on more details of these temperaments. How do you motivate them? What's a good spiritual life for each of these? And so next time, what we're going to talk about is maybe more real life applications as to how does this play out in families, in children, between married couples. Again, this is a topic I use a lot in marriage prep, because you run into these situations where you have two totally opposite temperaments present in the couple. And so to help them with how do they deal with each other, and then how do they deal with their children who will maybe also have a different temperament, because temperament is not so much genetic. It's part of the biology, but not so much genetic. And so you could have that case as well. And so in the next episode, we'll talk more about the temperaments in marriage and family life. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. We will see you guys next time. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org or find us on social media for other unique content.